Thank you for having me here today. This is the perfect talk for post-lunch. I'm a little post-absorptive. There's not a lot of blood flow going to my brain, so I'm going to do the best I can here. But we will not be talking about molecules for the next 20 minutes, if that helps. I've been doing the 2-day cardiopulmonary exercise test protocol to provide objective evidence of impairment for about 20 plus years. Can you hear me? Okay. For about 20 plus years. I've done it for various research projects. We've also used this protocol probably most frequently to provide objective evidence of impairment for people with fatiguing illnesses who in the United States are seeking disability or Social Security disability through their private insurer. So what I'm going to talk about today is a brief overview or the characteristics of post-exertional malaise, which I know you all know about. I'm just going to remind you because I know there's a strong online presence here, and I continue to be surprised and amazed that I still have to talk to people who come in for testing about post-exertional malaise because it's really not fully understood. We don't fully understand it, but they understand less of it. And I think it's important to just review that again. I'm going to talk about why we started using a cardiopulmonary exercise test for assessing post-exertional malaise. And not exactly, that's a whole different talk, but how you can use information from a cardiopulmonary exercise test protocol to assess impairment. So I just want to thank you again for bringing me here to Portugal. I know it's raining. I've heard over and over this is not typical weather, but what you're looking at here is what I'm going home to. So 8 inches of snow, 45 minutes from my house yesterday. So I'm still glad to be here. In 2015, the Institute of Medicine, now called the National Academy of Medicine, prepared a report which had 4 major objectives to it. And one major objective was to simplify the diagnostic criteria for ME/CFS. And this is what they came up with, and this is the clinical diagnostic criteria, and that's important to remember. I think it was pointed out yesterday that these are not research criteria. The hope and the objective was to help physicians make a diagnosis of ME/CFS, not to make it harder for them to make a diagnosis. And as you can see here, the second required element of this diagnosis is post-exertional malaise, in addition to the 2 optionals down at the bottom, either cognitive impairment or orthostatic intolerance. And a long time ago, Tony Komaroff described post-exertional malaise as the illness within the illness, and I think most people with ME/CFS and probably long COVID now would agree with that. It really defines what you're dealing with. By the way, this IOM report is still available. You can get it online at National Academies and .org. So characteristics of PEM. I think maybe the slide was up yesterday. I don't recall now. But the reason I'm pulling this slide up, this was a product of an intramural study that was done at the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And it was a focus group with ME/CFS persons. And what they learned from that was that PEM was really defined and influenced by 3 broad categories of stressors. And this is what I find I have to speak the most about when I'm talking about reducing your risk for provoking PEM. When we do a CPET, we are testing your physical stressor, but we're not testing your cognitive, maybe a little bit because we ask questions during the CPET, and certainly not the emotional stress on development of PEM. But what I remind every person who leaves our little clinic that your PEM load or tolerance is a sum total or a cumulative total of your physical, cognitive, and emotional stressors within a period of time. So you could have a physically inactive day, but a cognitively demanding day. A lot of time on the screen, at books, having conversations, having to talk in the doctor's office or get to the doctor's office. So it's important to realize that it's all of those combined that create the total of exertional stress that's provoking PEM symptoms. And we did see this slide earlier. From the same study, what they found was that the symptoms that people experience on a daily basis are most highly represented by exhaustion and what I know are not supposed to call brain fog, but there it is. Difficulty thinking clearly and mental, physical, cognitive processing rather, and some muscle aches and pains. On the other side here, you're seeing the symptoms that are characteristic after a cardiopulmonary exercise test, and they're not so terribly different. There's probably a little greater representation of cognitive dysfunction after a cardiopulmonary test, but in many cases they're quite similar. You might notice we've got some indicators of immune activation here, sore throat, headaches, and flu-like symptoms that might pop up after a cardiopulmonary test. But all in all, not so different from what you're experiencing on a daily basis. And if you want to ask me about that later on, I have another comment, but I'm going to save that because I got a lot to tell you. So why do we use a cardiopulmonary test to assess for post-exertional malaise? Because that's what we're doing. And just a reminder, because I get this question often, is this a diagnostic for ME/CFS? And it's not. You know, we don't have a biomarker. This is not one either. But we are assessing the impact of post-exertional malaise on one's ability to produce energy to do work after they've had an exertional stressor placed on them. And quite simply, a cardiopulmonary test, when they've been doing them for decades and decades with heart patients and pulmonary patients, et cetera, is to measure the effectiveness of the heart's, the circulatory system, heart, lungs, and the muscles to use oxygen to produce energy to do work. And that's what we're doing, only we do it twice. So information that you can get from one cardiopulmonary test, some of these are the variables that you can get. There are some variables from a cardiopulmonary test. We know how they're supposed to respond or behave when you do incremental exercise. And based on how they respond, you can actually delineate disease states based on the responses of these tests during incremental exercise. But of course, we're here because we're talking about the 2-day test. And so I need to talk about why we torture people for 2 days. It's not torture. You can talk to Joan about that. She's been through it before. But it's important to help provide objective evidence of impairment, how your PEM is affecting you. So in the United States, typically, attorneys are looking for 3 pieces of information to help support a case for disability. And one is typically the tilt table test to assess for orthostatic intolerance. If you are interested, the NASA lean test is a simple in-office test that can be done. We don't do it, and we don't do it because we can't afford to pre-fatigue you before your first cardiopulmonary test, but it's a simple test to administer, can be done in a doctor's office. The second, typically what attorneys are looking for to help support a case of disability is a neurocognitive assessment. And then lastly, the 2-day cardiopulmonary test. Also, additional information to have for someone who's dealing with a fatiguing illness is to begin to track their symptoms, come up with some little simple way of discerning whether you're having a good or a bad day. It might just be a number rating of your day or your morning and your afternoon, something simple that shows ultimately over time your pattern for how you're feeling over the course of several days and weeks. And characterizing, write down what you were like, what was your life like before you became ill and after you became ill, because every doctor's office you go to, if they have a clue about what they're trying to understand here with your symptoms, should ask you about that. And then lastly, begin to monitor your hours of either upright activity. I actually ask about, because I think it helps individuals to understand better when I ask about the percentage of their waking hours that they're sitting or lying down. I want to know how much time they're not on their feet. And any idea what most people tell me? what percentage of their waking hours they're sitting or lying down? 80 would be the low end. 80 to 95, 99. I haven't had anybody put 100 up because I'm sure they have to go up, stand up to go to the bathroom or something, but yeah. So we do 2 cardiopulmonary tests. For the same reason we do 1, but we need to add another little bit to the story. So the first test here is to determine your baseline functional capacity. And one thing that's really important if you're doing this protocol is that you provide information to prepare for the test ahead of time so that they know that 7 to 10 days before they come in for your test, they should be really laying low. You want them to come to the test in their baseline level of activity where they're not symptom exacerbated, okay? And that's a tough thing to do, and I'll tell you why in a second. They come in for the test, we get their baseline exercise capacity, presumably provoke their PEM symptoms, and then they come back on the second day, and we measure their PEM-influenced cardiopulmonary capacity then. And then we also make sure that we're screening for signs and symptoms. That's what SS is. Are they having normal signs and symptoms throughout the exercise test, or is something abnormal coming up? So we're routinely asking about, are they having pain? How hard do they feel they're exerting, which is called rating of perceived exertion? And are they having shortness of breath or dyspnea? And then, of course, we look at each test to determine whether their response was normal or not. So how do we use the data from a cardiopulmonary test to assess for post-exertional malaise? What we're learning from the cardiopulmonary test, one thing from the CPET, is their oxygen consumption at peak effort. We call that VO2 peak or VO2 max. If you're an exercise physiologist in the room, we're not going to have that debate. There's a subtle difference, but we don't care. You can then use that oxygen consumption, or you have to understand that oxygen consumption is an indirect measure of energy production, your ability to use oxygen to produce energy to do work. Another way of expressing oxygen consumption, or VO2, is to convert it to a unit of measure called a MET. And a MET stands for metabolic equivalent of task. And 1 MET is equivalent to 3.5 milliliters of oxygen consumed per kilogram of body weight per minute. And I know that's a mouthful, but essentially what you should know about a MET is 1 MET is roughly equivalent to a resting energy expenditure. The amount of energy, oxygen you need to consume to produce energy to stay alive at rest. That's what 1 MET is. All right. There's more to that story too, but that's another lecture. You can then take that oxygen consumption that you've converted to METs, and you can look up in the compendium of physical activity, how many METs are you doing when you're at your peak level of energy expenditure? And what is it equivalent to in terms of everyday tasks? So at the compendium, what you'll find is hundreds of different tasks that represent physical activities, sporting activities, occupational activities, walking at different speeds, so on and so forth, and their corresponding MET levels. So as an example, what you might see is something that looks like this, where you've got an activity here, cleaning, sweeping floors. That's about 3.3 METs. Okay, so that's 3.3 times what your energy requirements are when you're at rest. Does that make sense? All right. Notice here that sitting at rest or lying down at rest is, again, 1 MET. But if you're a fidgeter, you can burn a few more calories. Just pointing that out. So in order to understand what the 2-day test is telling us, you need to understand what is a normal response to a cardiopulmonary test and what is not normal. This is a very reproducible test. It's reproducible in heart patients, pulmonary patients, patients with cystic fibrosis, untrained patients, Olympic level athletes. They can come back on the second day and reproduce the test. They may not be very happy about it, but they can. So if we see a test where test 2 varies more than 7%, from test 1 in terms of their peak oxygen consumption, we know that's not a normal response. For oxygen consumption when they reach anaerobic threshold, that's a more variable measure, but we use about 12%. That's what the literature has shown us. It should vary within 12% from test 1 to test 2 when you look at the oxygen consumption at anaerobic threshold. The other things that you want to look at are, because we do have cases where individuals we test will repeat within normal limits the VO2 peak and the VO2 at VAT. But curiously, the amount of work they can do when they reach those levels is far less. So you always want to look at the workload that they're at when they reach their peak oxygen consumption and their anaerobic threshold. Autonomic indices are very interesting to me because, and we've had some great talks to understand why that might be the case. We expect, and one of the first things you have to do when you assess a 2-day CPET is you have to show evidence that the person worked very, very hard for each of those tests. And there are criteria for them. And one of the criteria is that they reach at least 85% of their age-predicted maximum heart rate. And there are other criteria, respiratory exchange ratio, which I won't get into, but we have to meet that criteria as well. And also their subjective assessment of how hard they felt they're working. So we use a Borg scale, which is a rating of perceived exertion. It's the only subjective piece of information we get from the person doing the test about how they feel during exercise. And we want that to be high enough. For us, we use what's called the 6 to 20 scale. We want it to be 17 or higher. So you want to be able to look at that to determine whether, if they worked very, very hard by the other criteria of peak effort, but they weren't able to drive their heart rate up, why is that the case? Is it due to what we call chronotropic incompetence, or are there other factors going on? Because you need to know whether they're on beta blockers or something that's suppressing their heart rate. Systolic pressure. I can't tell you the number of tests that I have looked at from other clinics where systolic pressure was reported at rest and reported at peak, and they didn't look at how they got from rest to peak. So we can talk about that later too. Responses related to POTS or orthostatic intolerance are important as well. And then I will tell you across the board, 100% of the time in the long COVIDs and in the MECFS, well, 99% of the time, we see abnormally low ventilation volume. So when they're at peak exercise, there are norm values for age and sex, and nobody ever reaches them. Typically, they're about 50% of normal. So I'm going to show you a little data here quickly because I know I'm limited on time. This is an individual we tested some time ago. She's 39 years old. Her age predicted max heart rate's 181. So we would like to see her get to at least a heart rate of 153, which is 85% of her age predicted max heart rate up there. And this is what she did. Well, I should say that she did satisfy the respiratory exchange ratio criteria and her rating of perceived exertion. She felt like she was working really, really hard, but her peak heart rate was 120. She's 39 years old. She couldn't drive it up over 120 on the first test. Her ventilation was 22% of what it would have been predicted for age and sex. And then if you look at test 2, it remained at 22% of age, sex norm. Heart rate didn't change. Peak oxygen consumption didn't change. Oxygen consumption at anaerobic threshold didn't change. Her heart rate, when she got to her anaerobic threshold, which is a guideline for pacing, actually dropped, even though everything else stayed the same. So from test 1, we know that she's got a very low peak heart rate, probably chronotropic incompetence, we could say. Low maximum ventilation on both tests. And if we look at her hemodynamic data, you can see that her systolic pressure here on test 1 was hypotensive, but it incremented in what would be considered a normal fashion. You would expect blood pressure, systolic pressure, to go up about 10 millimeters of mercury for every 30 watts of workload increase. So going from rest to 30 watts, her her blood pressure went from 97 to 110. So that's close. And again, from 30 to 60 watts, it went up almost another 10. But if you look at test 2 here, we see a little different story. Not only was her blood pressure at rest lower, but it didn't change. In fact, you could argue that it even dropped a little bit. But there's measurement error, of course, when we do this. But you have a blood pressure. She went from seated rest, what you're doing right now, to climbing stairs. That's about what that's like. And her blood pressure never went up, ever. So, you know, if you can't drive your blood pressure up to increase blood flow and delivery of oxygen to the muscles, you're not going to be able to do much work. Or to the brain fog. So we have resting hypotension, we have abnormal systolic blood pressure response. And if you take the data that you just got from this individual and you apply it to data from Weber and Janicki, who established well-accepted impairment standards based on heart failure patients, here's what you see. Her peak oxygen consumption, which was around 10, puts her in the moderate, right between moderate to severe and severe impairment. I do this all the time. This is how I write their reports up. And if you look at her oxygen consumption at anaerobic threshold, even though she repeated both of those variables from test 1 to test 2, she's still down in a severe category. So this is somebody who reproduced a test, but clearly cannot do any work. I mean, her anaerobic threshold is very low. So test 1 showed that she had hypotension, chronic chronotropic incompetence, low ventilation volume. Test 2 showed that she didn't, she continued to reproduce, but she had all of the indicators of autonomic nervous system dysfunction, heart rate, blood pressure, ventilation. The summary from her data, the corresponding METs to her peak oxygen consumption, so again, that's 10.7 divided by 3.5, converts it to METs, shows that if you go to the compendium of physical activity, you'll see that 3.1 METs is about equivalent to walking slowly downhill. At her peak effort, that's her maximum oxygen consumption. And that at anaerobic threshold, this is what we don't want you working over. She's reaching her anaerobic threshold just going to the bathroom, okay? So we derive lots of variables from doing cardiopulmonary exercise testing, and I'm not going to go through all of these. I just want to show you that there's a lot of information we get related to cardiovascular function, pulmonary, metabolic, so on and so forth. I want to emphasize that this is really important, these signs and symptoms. If you're not collecting them when you do these tests, you're not understanding how the person is feeling, and you're also missing out on, we have patients tremor sometimes after a test. Their extremities get very cold, which tells us a little bit about where the blood is not going. So those are the kinds of things you want to look at. And a few cautionary tales as I finish up here is that it's important that you pick the correct test protocol to match the person you're testing. We always test on a cycle because a cycle is while there's drawbacks to that, it's easily reproducible. If you test on a treadmill, the minute somebody puts their hand on a handrail, you've now changed the amount of work that they're doing, and you don't have control over that necessarily. Plus, there's balance issues oftentimes, so that's why we use a cycle. If you're doing the test, you don't warm up the patients. Many of these people will reach their anaerobic threshold during a warm-up. So don't do it. And I'll come back to some of these other things, but also note why the test ended. What was it? Ask the person, what was it that they were feeling at the end? What kind of fatigue, so on and so forth. So in order to really understand what the 2-day test is telling you, you have to know what is a normal response and what is not a normal response to incremental exercise. And if you don't know that, then it's really hard to understand what the 2-day test is telling you. And lastly, in my experience of testing 500 plus people using this protocol with fatiguing illnesses, is what we see over and over and over again. I call it the final common pathway of results or responses, is that we say poor blood flow, poor delivery of blood with oxygen to the muscles and the brain, that we're not measuring brain blood flow, but I just want to be clear, we see indicators of this, okay? Impaired ventilation almost across the board, and neuroinflammation. And the last one is based on, because they all do a symptom survey for us before and after the testing. And the selection of symptoms that some of them describe are inflammatory type symptoms. So as I pointed out earlier, the headache, flu-like symptoms, those kinds of things they'll report to us. So thank you again for having me. I just want to remind people we lost almost exactly a year ago. We lost a friend of MECFS, Byron Hyde, who was a physician in Canada, who was the first person to approach me about how do we do this and bring this protocol to Canada, and was, you know, a stalwart for his patients for many, many years. And oh yes, I have to put my one Portuguese word in there that I can say, obrigada. Thank you very much.